Now, before the passage of 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, there's another minor issue we need to address, which becomes important in the way different translations handle this passage. In the New King James, verse 3 says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." This concludes Paul's discussion of certain of these issues. He's wrapping up the letter. Some translations end the sentence right there. "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace." Boom. And then they start a new sentence in the middle of verse 33, which says, "As in all the churches of the saints, let your women keep silent in the churches." And that's the next sentence, which starts halfway in the middle of 33 and goes to verse 34. The dissection of that passage going into one verse and the other really is insignificant to me. That's not a major issue. The point is that they don't have the textual evidence to back that up. Even in the critical text, there's not much support for breaking it right there. Yet many of these newer translations, if not most, have broken the passage in the middle of verse 33, which makes it sound as if to say, in all the churches, women must stay silent, which raises a different issue. If you're one of those that thinks this was a local Corinthian conflict, then that suddenly changes the game, because now it says, in all the churches, women must keep silent, as in all the churches. And there is an indication that grammatically this does not make sense. What logic does it make to say the women must keep silent in the churches because in all the churches the women keep silent? Oh, that sounds like circular reasoning. Maybe you'll buy evolution too. The rocks date the fossils and the fossils date the rocks. No, it's pretty silly. But if people understood that that passage is a conclusion, verse 33 is a conclusion of everything that's gone before. In fact, where he says in all the churches of the saints is a phrase or similar phrases to it that he uses in a few of his epistles, and he always uses it at the end of the discussion, not to start one. So again, those evidences, those proofs, I encourage you to dig through not only the book he called her, but also the footnotes, and find those for yourself. It will be much more enlightening than just what we might say here. But I want to alert you to some of those issues that exist and the confusion with them. Furthermore, verses 34 and 35 are set apart with textual indicators in a few of the texts. So, textual indicators, markers showing that this is a block of verses and it stands out from the rest of the passage. Perhaps that is because in some of the passages, those verses are moved down, which changes the dynamic of what those verses are referring to, where they're placed. And again, I'm not endorsing that we use the critical text and that we change around these scriptures or anything. I'm just letting you know a little bit of the scholarly work that's gone on behind the scenes and some of the forces at play when a person interprets these passages. However, those textual indicators let us know that this block is unique from the rest of the text. And I just have to wonder, and maybe we'll never be able to prove this, if the scribes who copied those texts were not letting us know that those were quotations. Those verse 34 and 35 were quotations that Paul was referencing from a letter sent to him from Corinth. Now, there's several verses that refer to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, in 7, in 6. The letter kind of takes a turn halfway through the book, and Paul says, now about the things you wrote to me. And so he references those verses. Of the things that you wrote to me concerning this, I would say that. And of the things that you wrote to me about that, I would say this. And so he answers what they're saying. And so this is the same kind of concept Paul is doing, and he's dealing with a big one here toward the end of the letter, and that is that women are being asked to be quiet in the churches. It should be no surprise that Chloe is the one that writes him the letter. The congregation in her church raises this and says, hey, look, Paul, there's conflict, there's strife. Not just about what baptism a person has received. Did they get baptized by Apollos or Paul or Peter? Who baptized? No, you weren't. Paul wasn't crucified for you. Christ was. You're baptized into Christ. It's not the preacher. It's the Messiah. That's what matters. And so he settles those things right at the beginning. But there's all kinds of conflict going on, and this is one of those things that they approached him about. Now, a person might ask, if you're not really familiar with biblical literature, you might say, well, where are the quotation marks? If this was a quote from the church in Corinth, why didn't he set it out with some kind of brackets, quotation marks? As I mentioned, there might be that emphasis in one of the texts or two of them. But the deal is, Paul doesn't use quotation marks because quotation marks didn't exist. In fact, even when the Bible is quoted, there's no quotation marks. whether it's Matthew writing his gospel or John, or whether it's Paul writing a letter, when they quote scripture, they just go right into it. Here we go. And they just suddenly just slip in, throw in some verses from the Old Testament, and then go right back into what they were saying, and never even wink at you that this is a quote from the Bible. Because they understood their readers to be biblically literate enough that when they quoted Moses, when they quoted from the Old Testament, they would be aware of where that verse came from. Now, of course, there's great settings where Jesus says, it is written, or Paul says, is it not written? There might be references to those verses, but when they are, it's clearly indicated. When they're not there, there's still great quotes from Psalms. Romans chapter 1 would be an example of quoting from one psalm after another and just little bits and pieces here. And we can pick it up and put it back together because we know where it came from. Well, I wouldn't expect everybody reading a letter to Corinth that they would understand what it's saying because they didn't write the letter that he's answering. But those who wrote the letter would understand and recognize their own words when it's read back to them. And they would say, aha, now he gets to what I said. Or now he gets to the issue we're having here and this Jewish statement. So the dilemma is being dealt with, and it's being dealt with at Paul's pace. As he's dealt with some other issues, he comes back down and says, hey, don't tell women to be quiet in church. Don't forbid anyone to speak in tongues.